May 1943. Northern Tunisia. The dust hangs low along a narrow road outside Matur, drifting in thin veils beneath a sun that offers no mercy. Boots scrape against gravel. Prisoners move in silence. An American tanker walks among them, his uniform torn, face blackened by smoke and oil, lips cracked from thirst. 2 days ago, he was inside a burning M3 Lee tank, firing at German positions from less than a football field away. Now his hands are empty. His name is Dwight Steve Varner, a lieutenant of the U.S. 1st Armored Division, and at this moment he is one of the defeated. Axis guards shepherd the column forward, some German, some Italian men who no longer speak of victory, only of survival. Varner's steps slow. His breath steadies. Inside his pocket, his fingers curl around a cold piece of steel no bigger than his thumb. A teaspoon. From his mess kit. Worthless in battle. Useless against rifles. And yet on this road, under this sky, it is about to become something else entirely. Not a tool for eating. A weapon of illusion. A final gamble. One that will decide who walks free and who does not. By the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa had narrowed to a final, suffocating grip around Tunisia. What had begun months earlier as a desperate race for Egypt, oil routes, and control of the Mediterranean had become a war of exhaustion. British forces had broken the Axis at El Alamein. American and British troops had landed across French North Africa in Operation Torch. And now, like a closing vice, Allied armies had pushed into the last corner where German and Italian troops still resisted. Tunisia was no longer a campaign of conquest. It was a containment of defeat. The Axis bridgehead centered on Tunis and Bizertoise, collapsing under aerial bombardment and relentless ground assaults. Supply lines across the Mediterranean had been choked by Allied naval and air power. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition tighter still. Fresh replacements almost non-existent. Units that once advanced in polished formations now fought as fragments stitched together by necessity rather than doctrine. For the men on both sides, it was no longer about winning Africa. It was about surviving it. American forces had come into this war green and uncertain. The humiliation at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 had exposed weaknesses in U.S. doctrine, leadership, and coordination. German armor had cut through American lines with disciplined brutality, reminding the Allies that North Africa was not a training ground. It was a killing field. But by May, the U.S. Army was no longer the same force it had been in February. Hard lessons had been absorbed into blood. Commands were reshaped. Tactics were revised. And divisions that once wavered now pressed forward with a sharper edge. Among them was the U.S. 1st Armored Division, Old Ironsides, an outfit forged in dust and fire. Their tanks rolled not in glory, but in grit, pushing through broken villages and cratered roads, fighting German panzers in terrain that punished every mistake. The armored war in Tunisia was mechanical and intimate all at once. Tank battles unfolded at distances so short that crew members could see the faces of enemy soldiers between bursts of fire. Steel hulls clanged with impacts. Engines screamed in protest. Inside the tanks, heat rose like a living thing. Oil slicked the floors. Cordites stung the nose. Men shouted into intercom systems that crackled beneath engine noise. And outside, anti-tank shells searched for armor, seams with surgical precision. The American M3 Lee, the primary medium tank in early Tunisia, was a strange, awkward machinette's main gun mounted clumsily in the hull, its turret underarmed compared to German counterparts. It was a transition tank. Built-in emergency. Deployed in haste. Its crew fought not with confidence in the steel, but with faith in each other. By late April, the war compressed into its final weeks. Allied command launched its last coordinated blows across northern Tunisia. German Field Marshal Hans-Eugen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army was running out of room and out of time. Italian forces under General Giovanni Mess were equally strained, defending positions with dwindling resources and eroding morale. Airfields were bombed daily. Communications were disrupted nightly. Units pulled back only to find no line behind them. The front dissolved into pockets. Isolated battalions. Wandering columns of exhausted men following roads that led nowhere safe. Tunisia became not an organized battlefield, but a draining arena where every mile felt heavier than the last. Nowhere was this more evident than around the town of Matur. A quiet agricultural crossroads in peacetime, Matur had become a strategic node, in wartime a gateway toward the port city of Bizet, one of the last viable evacuation and supply routes for the Axis. The Germans could not afford to lose it. Neither could the Allies allow it to stand. When American armor moved toward Matur from the west, they were not just pushing against resistance. They were pressing into the hinge of the entire Axis defense in northern Tunisia. Break Matur, and the war in Africa would begin its final collapse. And within this broader sweep of desperate strategy and mechanical battle, there moved individual men. Lieutenants, drivers, gunners, loaders. Soldiers who could not see maps filled with arrows and symbols. Soldiers who experienced the war not as diagrams and plans, but as heat and fear and the smell of metal burning. One of them was Dwight Steve Varner, a young tanker with a company under his command. A man who had already seen his tank punched full of holes, who had already lost men under his leadership, who would soon find himself stepping into a different kind of fight, not against armor and artillery, but against despair, improvised with nothing but nerve in his pocket and defeat behind his eyes. And as American columns continued to grind eastward toward Matur and Bizet, tightening the noose around the Axis, Varner's own war was about to shrink into something much smaller: a road, a handful of guards, and a decision measured in inches of steel. When the American armor reached the approaches to Matur in early May 1943, the wall narrowed into a struggle of hills, hedgerows, and hard ground that offered no shelter from shells. The town itself lay in a shallow basin, its red-tiled roofs pressed low beneath ancient hills that were now crowded with machine guns, mortars, and waiting anti-tank guns. German forces understood what Matur represented. It was a choke point, one of the last corridors leading north toward Bizet and the sea. If those roads fell, the Axis armies in Tunisia would be severed from escape and supply. So they stood their ground. Units from the German 10th Panzer Division were fed piecemeal into defensive belts, supported by Italian formations whose lines were stretched thin but whose duty anchored them just the same. What awaited the Americans here would not be a dramatic breakout, but a grinding advance measured in yards and bodies. The US 1st Armored Division rolled forward under banners already stained by Kasserine. They were no longer an untested force. Their commanders no longer optimistic. Tunisia had stripped innocence from every crew. Tanks now advanced cautiously, one by one, hulls angled, gunners straining through sights for the faintest shadow of a barrel or movement behind brush. Artillery hammered the hills ahead like clockwork. Infantry moved in short bounds across open ground, hugging shrubs and shallow dips in the dirt. It was not fluid. It was violent. Methodical. A final bloodied push to end a campaign that had already consumed thousands. Within this advance moved Company H of the 13th Armoured Regiment, part of the 1st Armoured Striking Power. Their tanks nosed forward into danger with orders short and blunt: press, probe, break the line. At the front of one of those armoured spear points was Lieutenant Dwight Varner, 25 years old, tank commander, from Illinois. A man who had trained for war on American fields and was now fighting it on foreign soil with machines that rattled as much as they roared. His tank, an M3 Lee, was already something of an anachronism by 1943. Built-in urgency, never intended for prolonged frontline service, it fought German panzers that were faster, better armoured, and more cleanly armed. But Warner and his crew did not have the luxury of waiting for better equipment. The M3 Lee was what they had. And what they had, they drove straight into fire. The fighting outside Mateurs surged and recoiled like surf against rock. Tanks sometimes advanced without infantry, only to be driven back by concealed guns. At other moments, infantry surged ahead alone, chased to ground by machine gun bursts. Each ridge, each cluster of stone walls, became its own micro-battle. The German gunners were skilled, patient, lethal. They waited until American armor showed a flank, until a turret rotated, until a vehicle hesitated, then fired. When they hit, they did not wound. They destroyed. A single round could tear through the side of a tank and turn the interior into an oven in seconds. On May 5th, Warner pushed his tank forward into exactly that kind of engagement. Ahead of him lay German gun positions, dug in and camouflaged among the rough northern terrain. He closed within perilous range, nearly close enough to hear enemy shouted commands. His tank absorbed hit after hit. Steel rang like a bell struck by hammers. Inside, his men fought the machine as much as the enemy, clearing jams, shifting gears, holding to positions slick with oil and sweat. Then the decisive blow came. A direct armor-piercing round slammed into the hull. Metal ruptured. Smoke and fire swallowed the interior. The engine died in a scream of grinding steel. Warner's tank rolled to a halt in the dirt. This was how capture began, it with surrender, but with sudden stillness. German soldiers emerged from cover cautiously, weapons raised, circling the burning wreck like hunters approaching wounded prey. Warner and his surviving crew climbed out into enemy hands. They were stripped of pistols, binoculars, documents. Ordered into a growing column of other Americans, taken in the fighting. Smoke from the battlefield drifted behind them as they were marched away from the sound of guns. They did not know it then, but they were walking out of the war that would soon be over and into a situation where salvation would not come from tanks, aircraft, or reinforcing armies. 2 days passed. 2 days of marching. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion. German guards rotated in and out. Italian troops appeared more frequently as the column moved eastward through fractured lines. The axis of authority blurred. Orders came in accents thicker. Drills looser. Discipline less uniform. The prisoners noticed these things quietly. Catalogued them. You survive by noticing. And somewhere in his pocket, forgotten since the moment of capture, Warner carried one small remnant of his old life as a fighting soldier. A spoon, tucked into cloth. A utensil from an army mess kit. Harmless. Unnoticed. And yet, as the road stretched on beneath the Tunisian sun, it was the only weapon he had. Lay the world of a tanker in 1943 was one of shrinking horizons and magnified dangers. Inside an armoured vehicle, space compressed the body and stretched the nerves. A man lived inches from machinery hot enough to burn skin on contact. Gun breeches recoiled into ribs. Turrets trapped heat until breathing fell thick. And every crewman learned, quickly, that the steel shell around them was less a fortress than a gamble. Their safety depended on angles, speed, and luck. For American crews in M3 Lees, the truth was even harsher. They fought in a tank already surpassed by enemy machines. German Panzer III and the 4th tanks mounted faster guns with better penetration. Their silhouettes were lower, harder to spot, harder to hit. American gunners had to expose themselves, adjust positioning, and press closer to strike enemies with weapons mounted awkwardly in the hull. There was no romance inside a tank. Just sweat, fear, and constant calculation. A crew did not measure time by clocks. They measured it in shells fired, hits absorbed, and seconds walked past death. Across the battlefield stood the men tasked with stopping them. German soldiers in Tunisia were still dangerous, thoroughly drilled and commanded by officers who had already steamrolled across Europe. They built kill zones with care and waited for armor to wander into sight lines. But beside them were Italian units brave in patches, exhausted in greater measure. Italy's war in Africa had already stretched too far beyond its reach. Equipment shortages were chronic, leadership often inconsistent. And by spring 1943, Italian morale was brittle. Tunisia felt less like a front and more like a corner. Soldiers fought, knowing the sea behind them was no sanctuary. Every Allied mile gained whispered the same question into Italian ranks: when does this end? And for whom? Being taken prisoner on this battlefield was neither clean nor orderly. There were no careful searches, no documentation, no proper facilities awaiting capture. Men were simply collected, lined up, moved. The Tunisian landscape offered no comfort. Dust-coated mouths. Water bottles emptied and stayed empty. Prisoners walked until feet blistered and shoulders sagged. Talk dwindled. The body focused inward when strength drained away. For American tankers, men accustomed to steel, engines, and fire, the sudden vulnerability of marching unarmed between guards was a different battle altogether. There were no orders to follow now. No commands to bark. Only watchfulness. Waiting. Survival lived in small calculations. Which guard was nervous? Which was tired? Which was careless? And in that forced silence, among staggered columns and drifting sand, the spoon in Varna's pocket waited unnoticed, just another scrap of metal. For now. War is not only violence. It is belief. A man pulls a trigger not merely because he is ordered to, but because he believes the weapon in his hands will answer. Armies advance not just on fuel and reinforcement, but on confidence that someone, somewhere, still holds the line. Throughout history, battles have been decided by fear as often as by firepower. Decoys have drawn bombardments. Inflatable tanks have stalled divisions. Orders shouted with authority have moved men who never stopped to ask who gave them. In this war, deception was not an art, it was survival. For Dwight Varner, stripped of rank, weapon, and authority, deception would become the last currency he could still trade in. A spoon in his pocket would have to speak the language of a gun. The Italian soldiers who stood ahead of him on that road were not cowards, but they were men at the end of a war they did not choose and could no longer win. In May 1943, Tunisia already felt like a trap closing. They had watched German aircraft dwindle, heard rumours of Allied armoured columns pushing inward from every direction. Orders became vaguer, rations thinner, morale frayed. And in war, uncertainty is its own enemy-eroding focus, inviting hesitation. Italian troops often manned blocking positions with orders that arrived late and changed often. They were isolated from reassuring command structures. When Varna and his fellow prisoners crossed paths with Italian soldiers on that dusty road, the Italians were already carrying defeat like weight. They were not expecting resistance from prisoners. But the human mind does not distinguish easily between bluff and reality when exhaustion and fear blur the edges of certainty. Soldiers carry strange things into battle. Letters, coins, religious medals, photographs, and always, tucked into packs and pockets, the unremarkable utensils of life. A tin cup, a fork dulled by years of scraping canned meat, a spoon bent slightly by heat or accident. These tools outlast boots and belts. They outlive battles. They are quiet witnesses to fear and hunger and survival. Varna's spoon had been shaped by mess halls and sandstorms, not gunfire. It was never meant to be heavy, never meant to threaten. But war does not care what something was meant to be. It elevates ordinary objects into extraordinary roles. A helmet becomes a water basin. A map becomes a blanket. And now, a spoon pressed through cloth into the outline of a pistol would challenge soldiers who carried real rifles and real ammunition. There was no brilliance in the gesture. No theatrical flourish. Just calculation. If he was going to act, it had to be immediate. If he hesitated, the moment would rot away like all moments do in war. And so, beneath an open sun on a crumbling road, Dwight Varner prepared to gamble everything not on firepower, but on the fragile machinery of fear. The road stretched eastward through scrub and stone, a scar through sunlight. Prisoners shuffled in a thin column, shoulders low, boots scuffing dust that no wind came to lift. 2 days had passed since Varner's tank burned itself out on the fields near Matur. 2 days of thirst. 2 days of uncertainty. And now, somewhere along this narrowing ribbon of earth, the procession stalled. Italian soldiers stepped forward, rifles slung casually, eyes dulled not by cruelty but by fatigue. They were not expecting trouble. Prisoners did not cause trouble. Prisoners complied. That was the rule this war had taught them. Varner did not speak at first. He watched where they stood. Watched the space between their feet. Watched the way one soldier leaned lazily against a tree trunk with his rifle hanging from one hand. This was not a firing squad. This was a junction. A momentary confusion between columns and commands. Somewhere ahead, German authority thinned. Italian authority filled the gap. And a crack appeared. His hand slipped into his pocket. The spoon met his fingers like a small cold certainty. He rotated it slowly. Pressed its curved back against the fabric from inside. The rounded shape pushed outward, enough to suggest not steel made for eating but steel shaped for killing. And then he lifted his eyes. When Varner spoke, his voice carried none of the ragged desperation of a prisoner. It carried the flat, brittle edge of command. A voice men obey when they believe death crouches behind it. He raised his hand. Not quickly. Not theatrically. Just enough that the cloth pulled tight over the metal beneath. The illusion was complete. The angle was right. The confidence precise. The Italian soldiers froze. Fear does not announce itself. It arrives silently. In the stiffening of backs. In the widening of eyes. In the heavy pause where no one moves because no one wants to be the first. Varner did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply gestured. Weapons were raised. Slowly. Carefully. Not by him but by them. Rifles shifted off shoulders and tilted toward the dirt. Fingers opened. Belts loosened. The road, moments ago a place of marching, turned into a stage of surrender. The men who had guarded him now stood uncertain. Looking at a prisoner they suddenly no longer understood. Another American, Joseph Zupancic, moved beside him. Still. Watchful. Ready. He did not know about the spoon. He did not need to. All he saw was authority. In that frozen space between dust and disbelief, Dwight Varner captured his first enemy soldiers without firing a shot. The war reversed its direction in a heartbeat. And the spoon never left his pocket. Once it began, it did not pause. Momentum in war is a physical thing. It either belongs to you or it buries you beneath it. Varner did not allow breath between actions. He moved like a man who understood that hesitation was the only real enemy now. The Italian soldiers disarmed, stunned, were ordered into formation, relieved of their belts and weapons with the same quiet authority that had seized them. Zupancic helped secure rifles, pistols, ammunition. Nothing dramatic. Just efficiency. 2 men doing what had been done to them days earlier, only now from the other side of the balance. Further down the road, a truck appeared. 8 Italian troops rode in the back, lounging in the careless posture of men who believed the danger was somewhere else. Varna stepped into view as if he had every right to stand there. His posture spoke before his mouth ever could. He raised his hand. The spoon pressed outward once more. Zupancic flanked him with a captured weapon, now visibly real. The truck slowed. Then stopped. Orders were given. Sharp. Measured. The driver obeyed. The men in the back hesitated and then complied. They dismounted into confusion, their eyes darting between Varna and Zupancic. They saw weapons. They saw confidence. They did not see illusion. And illusion was all that mattered. Now the column grew. Prisoners followed prisoners. Armed men guarded disarmed ones. War rearranged itself around 2 Americans who days earlier had been nothing but marching shadows. Before the dust had time to settle, Varna repeated the gesture once more, this time not against Italian soldiers, but Germans. 17 of them. German troops were not easily shaken. But chaos has a language that all soldiers recognize. The sight before them did not speak of lone prisoners. It spoke of a mobile unit. Italian captures. Trucks. American soldiers armed and authoritative. Varna did not sell a threat. He sold a situation. And to men already worn thin by retreat and isolation, that situation looked very real indeed. They surrendered. One by one. Weapons set down. Helmets unbuckled. Orders obeyed that had not come from any officer they could name, but which felt no less absolute. Within minutes, Varna and Zupancic held more than 20 enemy soldiers, 2 trucks, and a growing ledger of the impossible. They did not waste it. Time did not permit pride. They loaded prisoners. They confiscated maps. They climbed behind wheels still warm from someone else's hands. And then they did something even more dangerous than the bluff itself. They drove. They drove through territory still riddled with uncertainty. Through roads where a wrong uniform, a wrong word, a wrong glance could end everything. The trucks moved not as fugitives but as functionaries. No racing. No hiding. Just a steady pace that suggested purpose. Conviction is camouflage when worn properly. Finally, beyond a bend in the road, American soldiers appeared. And when Varna and Zupancic brought the trucks to a halt and climbed out grim-faced, dust-caked, no one knew what they were looking at. 2 prisoners had returned with an army. And in Varna's pocket, the spoon was still warm from his hand. American soldiers gathered slowly at first, eyes narrowed, rifles still shouldered. They did not trust the picture before them. 2 dirty tankers stepping out of captured trucks. More than 20 Axis soldiers spilling out behind them. Germans mixed with Italians. Helmets in hands. Weapons stacked on command. War taught men never to believe what looked easy. But as Varna began to speak quietly, simply the disbelief gave way to wonder. The account would roll through the encampment like static. A spoon. A pocket. A bluff carried across miles of enemy ground. Officers were called. Reports written. Names recorded. And slowly, the story hardened into fact. Lieutenant Dwight Varna and Sergeant Joseph Zupancic had done what battlefields rarely permit. They had folded war in on itself. They had reversed captivity. Formal recognition would follow, methodical and quiet. The US Army did not trade in legend easily. It traded in documentation, statements, verification. And once the facts were assembled, once distances, figures and timelines aligned, the conclusion was unavoidable. This had not been luck. This had been courage shaped into strategy. Both men were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the United States Army. The citation did not embellish. It did not need to. It described simply how a captured tanker used a spoon to create the illusion of a weapon and turned prisoners into captors. It recorded how two men captured dozens. It made official what sounded like fiction. For Varna, medals followed him not as trophies but as echoes. He would also carry the Silver Star, the Purple Heart for wounds earned among burning armor, a prisoner of war medal marking a journey not many survived psychologically intact. And from Italy itself, an Italian military cross for valor, given by a nation whose soldiers he had once disarmed with nothing but nerve. War is full of ironies, but few cast shadows so long. Beyond Varna himself, the war raced forward without slowing. The Tunisian campaign was nearing its end. Axis formations were evaporating under relentless Allied pressure. Towns fell not in days but in hours. Entire units surrendered in masses too large to count without ledgers. German officers, once precise and aloof, now signed capitulation documents with paper already yellowed by inevitability. Italy's commitment to Africa collapsed into silence. What remained of the Axis in Tunisia retreated not toward victory but toward the shore. Varna's episode, extraordinary though it was, took its place among thousands of stories that would never be told beyond a few campfires and citation folders. Men who lived because someone else gambled. Men who died because someone else hesitated. His story survived not because it was convenient but because it was true. Because it could be proven. Because something absurd had carved itself into the rigid language of military record. And while Tunisia prepared to close its chapter of suffering under mass surrender and Allied flags rising over Tunis and Bizerte, one man's quieter war had already ended. But the echoes of what happened on that road had only begun. Within days of Varna's return to American lines, the war in Tunisia collapsed with staggering speed. On May 7th, Allied troops entered Tunis. On the same day, British forces secured Bizerte. Axis resistance continued in fragments for only a short while longer before ending altogether. By May 13, 1943, the final surrender was complete. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. Entire armies were erased not by annihilation but by inevitability. For the Axis, North Africa ended not with one last counterattack, but with silence. Trucks stood empty. Airfields abandoned. Maps useless. The Mediterranean, once a contested artery, became an Allied corridor. The American army that emerged from Tunisia was not the same force that entered it. Kasserine Pass had rewritten doctrine. Mater had carved confidence. What Tunisia taught US forces could not be found in any stateside training manual. It taught them how to fight Germans and survive doing it. Armor units reorganized. Command structures sharpened. Coordination between infantry, tanks, and aircraft tightened into form. Tunisia became the anvil on which the United States Army reshaped itself into a modern fighting force, ready for the invasions of Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. Inside that transformation lived Varna's story, not as spectacle, but as signal. A reminder that war did not belong exclusively to machinery or mass. It belonged to men willing to improvise. To decide when a situation was no longer governed by rules and act accordingly. Tankers spoke about it in hushed tones, not with exaggeration, but with awe. A spoon. Officials recorded it. Soldiers whispered it. Newcomers were told not to dismiss it. Varna went on with his life after the war, carrying not just medals, but memory. He did not monetize his story. He did not dramatize it. He lived as he had fought with quiet dignity and economy of words. Those who later researched his war did not do so because of spectacle. They did so because the paperwork existed. Because his citations stood firm under scrutiny. Because the war itself had recorded what his conscience never tried to advertise. And history, indifferent to romance, preserved it anyway. Across generations, his story endured not through exaggeration, but agreement. Universities archived it. Veterans repeated it. Military historians paused at it. Not because it redefined strategy, but because it exposed something raw inside it. The fragility beneath authority. The power hidden inside posture. The thin curtain between order and collapse. And somewhere in a collection box or personal drawer, perhaps the spoon remained unremarkable in every way, except one: that it had held an army at bay. War is most often remembered by its machines. By the thunder of artillery, the silhouettes of tanks, the cold geometry of aircraft crossing a darkened sky. History measures victory in cities taken and territories lost, in arrows on maps and numbers that stretch into the thousands. But sometimes, the truth of war does not live inside any statistic. Sometimes it lives in a pocket. In the weight of an object never meant to matter. A teaspoon, smoothed by use, carried across oceans, ignored for months, waiting for a moment small enough to belong to it alone. When Dwight Varner stood on that road in Tunisia, the war was already nearly over. Flags would soon change. Prisoners would soon be counted. Generals would soon sign documents that ended fighting in Africa forever. But for him, the war did not end with papers or ceremonies. It ended with a decision. With a breath held just long enough to step into danger, armed with nothing but belief. The spoon did not stop bullets. It did not block rifles. It did not conquer ground. What it did was reveal something older than war itself: that authority is fragile, that fear is contagious, and that courage sometimes needs no weapon to become force. There are museums filled with tanks that no longer move, guns that no longer fire, aircraft that will never again leave the ground. But the smallest artifact of that road in 1943 would never make it behind glass. Because its power was never in what it was, but in what one man chose to make it. And somewhere, far from North Africa, long after the dust settled, there remained only a simple truth quietly written into history: that once, in a war built on steel and fire, a man survived with nothing but a spoon.